Shabbat Shalom, everybody. As you can see, I'm in different clothes to the clothes that I was in throughout the service. As I'm filming this, I've just come from working in the hospital, so that's why you see me in scrubs. So, today we'll be doing our Drash as we always do. Instead of doing a parashah study though, I've decided to hopefully introduce a very interesting topic. I'm planning to do a 6-part series on the origin of and the story of the Iberian crypto Jews, and that involves the story of the Sepharad-the, the Jews of Spanish and Portuguese descent, and their story throughout the generations as a persecuted minority, with some great highs and great lows, and then their story as sort of hidden or crypto Jews throughout the Spanish territories. So in sort of the first slide, I wanted to say, why bother learning about this? Why is this topic of any interest to anyone, and why should we spend any time on it at all? Well, that's a good question. So in this slide, I've actually listed a few reasons why I think it'll be a good story for us to learn about. Well, first of all, I think it's a really interesting story, and it's a story that is not very well known. It's not as well taught and well studied as the story of the European Ashkenazi Jews, for example. So I think firstly, from a pure interest and knowledge point of view, it would be an interesting story to study. And it's a very exciting story. It's full of triumph and tragedy. It's got ups and downs, highs and lows. And it's a story that is, if you're reading a book about someone's making a movie about this history, it'd be a truly interesting, an interesting thing to watch and read. So again, from a pure interest point of view, I think it'll be very interesting. And also in a more spiritual sense, it speaks to God's redemptive willingness and redemptive ability in our lives. I think really with this particular story, this particular narrative with the Sepharad-the and then the crypto Jews, we really see how God is willing and able to redeem his people, both individually and as a group. So I really think that's an encouraging and educational thing for us to learn. And also I think it's a story that's immersed in prophecy, and arguably a fulfillment of prophecy as well, which I will explain later on. So in the next slide, I've sort of described the overall structure of what we're going to learn. So there's sort of 2 main parts to this study. It's going to be a study over multiple weeks. I'm going to dedicate roughly 3 weeks per half. The first half will be up till 1492, so the history of the Sepharad-the, the Spanish Jews, up until 1492, and the second, which will be divided into 3 parts each, roughly. And then the second half will be the story of the crypto Jews after 1492, which is the expulsion of Spain, as we'll see later. And then divide that into roughly 3 parts. So total, I'm planning to do roughly 6 weeks of talking about this with a different section on different parts of the story. Now today we'll be starting at the beginning, of course, as any good story, and we'll be talking about the origins of the Sepharad-the. And what does the word Sepharad-the or Sepharad mean? So in Hebrew, the word Sepharad equals Spain, and therefore the word Sepharad-the refers to the Jews of sort of Spanish and Portuguese, so Iberian sort of descent, and also including their territories, so Latin America as well. And these Jews have of course spread to other countries since then and mixed with other Jewish communities, but they have maintained a uniquely rich and vibrant, unique culture and religious tradition. So it is a particular type of people we are studying within Judaism overall. Also, a side note, I've sort of explained here that with the presentations that I'm going to be doing, I'm not going to be including references in the presentation slides, only because I've used a lot and it's not going to be very aesthetically pleasing if I include every single reference with the slides. What I do plan to do, and I've already started, is to create it was originally going to be a long essay, but now it's sort of evolved into a short book. To sort of write a book with all the written accounts of what I'm saying, plus much more detail, and I'll make it available at some point. And that will contain references which you'll be able to look at more deeply. So in the next slide, I've just got here a map of Spain, a bit of geography. You guys know by now I very much like geography. And I've got here a map of Spain. As you can see, Portugal is there too, unfortunately, and not in as much detail as Spain. But I just wanted to sort of highlight the territory we actually are going to be studying, and we can see here that I've put some arrows into some of the more well-known Jewish communities. Of course, they were spread across all throughout Spain and Portugal, but I've highlighted only a few of the major spots. So in the east and northeast of Spain, which would have been Aragon in those days, like the community of Zaragoza and Barcelona. In the south was the heartland of sort of the golden age of Spain, which we'll discuss later. In Andalusia, which is, was named by the Arabs who conquered that area in the 8th century. Toledo in the center, near the capital, was also a great center of Jewish life in those days. And I've put an arrow into Portugal, in northeast Portugal, because that was really a great center of 20th century crypto-Judaism. Actually, a very fascinating story, which I will talk about in a future episode, about how a Jewish man from from Poland actually discovered a group of secret Jews in the 20th century, and they had kept their traditions alive. It was really a fascinating story, which I'll talk about in a future episode. But now, in the next slide, I'll get into the nitty-gritty, the origins of the Sephardim. Where did they come from? So the answer is we don't exactly know. We don't exactly know when they arrived in the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula describes all of Spain and Portugal. But we have a few sort of ways of looking at it. The first way of looking at it is through archaeology. So if we're looking for cold, hard archaeological facts, cold, hard evidence we can touch and we can feel, we have to go to a fragment which was found actually by a German team. They found a marble slate with the Hebrew word Yehiel, or Yehiel, which was written in Hebrew on a marble plate. And it was probably someone's name, and probably from a tombstone. And that was dated to about 390 of the Common Era, so within the later Roman Empire. That's the earliest physical, tangible evidence, so something that you can touch and feel, of Jewish presence in the Iberian Peninsula. So it really was an amazing discovery, because the previous discovery before that only had Latin fragments, and they were much later. But this one was a Hebrew fragment, which was unusual, because usually even Jews in the Roman times wrote in Latin. So it was a really amazing discovery when it happened in 2012. So that's probably the earliest archaeological evidence that we have. In the next slide, I want to go through actually some of the references in the New Testament. So the New Testament is actually an excellent historical source, not only for obviously spiritual and theological understanding, but also understanding the situation of the Jewish people in Roman times. It actually is a really excellent resource. And Paul actually talks a little bit about his travels, of course, and in part of his travels, he talks about Spain and how he went to Spain to witness to the Jews and Gentiles there. There's no specific mention of a Jewish community in Spain in his references, but we know from the pattern of Paul's evangelism that he always went to communities with large Jewish presences, and he always taught to the synagogues and to the Jews first. So we have the pattern to the Jew first, also to the Greek, to the Gentile. And even though Paul was obviously a much more successful apostle among the Gentiles, and he's known as the apostle to the Gentiles, his pattern always was to preach to the Jews first. So I would have thought it would have been inconceivable for Paul to go such a long way out of his way if there were not any Jews there. So in Romans 15, there are a couple of passages I'll quickly read. And he says in verse 24 of Romans chapter 15, "I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain, and to be helped on my journey there by you, once I have enjoyed your company for a while." And in verse 28, he says, "When therefore I have completed this, and I have delivered to them what has been collected, I will leave for Spain by way of you." So a couple of times he talks about going to Spain. So one can assume that there were Jews there. Now, the next slide, I'm going to be talking about Talmudic sources. So the Talmud is also a really varied literary work, and a lot of it has really useful insights into Jewish history. So I do think it's an excellent resource for piecing together parts of Jewish history. And there's so many things which we can point to in my book that I'll be writing. There'll be a few more than this, but I've highlighted just one legend from the Midrash in Leviticus Rabbah, and it says in Leviticus Rabbah 29 verse 2, "Be not dismayed, Israel." So this is apparently God speaking. "For I will deliver you from far away," and skipping a bit, "from Gaul and Spain and its fellows." So again, a reference here to the Jewish presence in Spain. Now the Talmud itself was comprised in sort of times after Yeshua, but they point to earlier traditions, which were supposedly from even Second Temple or earlier. So again, there's a hint, a strong hint of an earlier Jewish presence, even before the Roman Empire. And also the rabbis as well. The rabbis had their own theories and their own legends which they created, or legends which were passed on to them, which they preserved. Again, one such example, I'll only share one example for the sake of this video. It was contained in a book called Seder Hayom, which was written in 1605 in Venice, actually, by Moses ben Machir. So Moses ben Machir wrote this book called Seder Hayom in 1605. And a small part of it refers to this gentleman hearing about a legend. Essentially, the legend was about some of the captives of the first exile, how some of them did not come back to Israel because they were not with Ezra in the exile, but they went to a different part of the world to be in exile, and they didn't actually heed Ezra's call to come back to the land. And the reason why this happened, according to Ben Machir, was they thought it was futile to go back into the land because they knew that the temple would be rebuilt, but then be destroyed again. We're not sure how they had this knowledge or this opinion, but that was their opinion. And basically they thought that they were going to have to go into exile all again anyway. So they thought, these people, they thought it was better to stay in their land where they were and just worship God and serve God where they were, and not uproot themselves over and over again. And then these guys were called what Ben Machir calls those in Tulay Tula. It's a bit of a tongue twister. Tulay Tula was Toledo. So he says that these were the Jews of Toledo who said this. So that points to a time in the first exile, so between the temples. And we could even go back even earlier, possibly, this is where it gets really sketchy, by considering Tarshish. So Tarshish is a place which is referenced a few times in the Old Testament. In 1 Kings, when it talks about sort of the riches of Tarshish, which King Solomon he sort of was referring to in the height of his wealth and power. And also in Ezekiel, when it talks about the trade that Israel did with Tarshish. And this was sort of at the height of Israel's glory during Solomon's reign. And Jonah, as we know in the book of Jonah, he also fled to Tarshish to escape God's calling for him. He was escaping God's instructions for him to call Nineveh to repent, and he wanted to flee as far away as he could. And he went to Joppa, or Yafor, and he went to get a ship and to go to Tarshish, presumably to go as far away from what he thought was the presence of God as he could possibly go. And it's interesting because we don't really know where Tarshish was. We don't even know if it was an actual place. I've said here in this slide that Tarshish could have been just simply a coast, just a coast far away. We don't know if it was a real place. But one of the possibilities that has been proposed, it was a place called Tartessus, which was in southern Spain, near Gibraltar. And this was supported by the fact that Joppa, or Yafor, was obviously on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, near modern-day Tel Aviv. And if you wanted to sail away from it, you would go west. And in those days, one of the furthest west that you could possibly go, while being in the known world, was to Spain. So geographically, there is a small bit of sort of circumstantial evidence. Again, we're not really sure, just an idea. So who knows? But if Tarshish was indeed in Spain, then that will obviously point to a presence of Jews in the first temple period. So again, possibly there were Spanish Jews right until the first temple period, but probably more reliably during the Roman Empire. Now, of course, the Jews stayed in Spain even after the Romans were expelled. The Romans were expelled definitively from Iberia in 481 of the Common Era by the Visigoths, which are basically European kingdoms, so we would call barbaric kingdoms, which sort of came in from the north and northeast. Now, these guys, as far as the Jews were concerned, mostly left the Jews alone. They were more involved with sort of fighting, other Christian sects, but essentially at the Third Council of Toledo in 589, they converted from their previously held Arianism to Catholicism. I don't really have time to go into too much what they were, but there were sort of two competing theologies as to how to relate to the persons in the Trinity. But essentially there was a conversion to Catholicism made by the Visigoths in 589. And then after that, for the next 120 years, until the Arab-Muslim conquest of Iberia, the Jews were under sort of variable but usually intense persecution. And such restrictions that were placed upon them included being forbidden to hold public office, being forbidden to proselytize, being forbidden to eat with Christians or generally associate with Christians, forbidden to hire Christian workers, and also they were forbidden to marry Christians as well. And intermarried couples, which already existed at the time, they had to both convert to Christianity, and if they did not, they would both be exiled. It was quite a harsh punishment. And oftentimes, actually, they were killed as well, and there were lots of, increasing sort of intensity and frequency of massacres at this time. It was quite a distressing time for the Jews of Iberia during the sort of Catholic Visigoth reign. However, it was fairly short-lived. By the year 711, the invading Arab Muslim conquerors, called the Moors, drove the Visigoths out. So in this slide, I sort of point out that within 3 years, they actually captured, pretty much almost the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula. If you saw that map earlier, almost the entirety of that. Only in the far northeast of Spain, where the Pyrenees mountains sort of blocked them, there was a small section which was held by Christian hands. And that was the status quo for the next few centuries. So the Arab Muslims controlled most of the peninsula. And this development would change in Jewish history forever in this part of the world. Not only for the Sephardim, but also for the entirety of the Jewish diaspora, really. Because, even though Jews were not especially free under Muslim rule, but they would have enough freedom and enough protection to thrive. And to really understand this, I'll be talking in the next slide about the Jews and therefore the Christians' also status under Muslim rule, because I think it's a bit misunderstood, especially given the politics of today. So, as we know, the Muslims, after they conquered Iberia, starting from 711 of the Common Era, they would dominate the peninsula for many centuries. And the way they dealt with Jews and Christians, so a lot of people say, it was either a great paradise, multicultural paradise, or it was terrible tyranny. The answer is it was neither of those extremes. It was somewhere in between. And it was heavily influenced by the Pact of Umar. Now, the Pact of Umar was, people doubt the authenticity of these documents, but essentially it's alleged that in the year 697 of the Common Era, Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab made a treaty with the Christians of Syria. And therefore, in the sort of following centuries, it really inspired how Muslim kingdoms would treat Christians and Jews within their dominion. So we're not sure if there was actually a real document, but nevertheless, it inspired how Muslims would treat Jews and Christians. Now, I'll try and summarize this document in a very succinct way in this slide. The main tenet of this pact was that non-Muslims who were not pagans, so that really meant in those days Jews and Christians, so non-Muslims who were non-pagans, so people of the book, which were Jews and Christians, were not to be compelled to accept Islam by force. So when Islam conquered the pagan lands, they forced the local populations to accept Islam by force or to face death or exile. For Jews and Christians, it was not going to be like this under the Pact of Umar. In return for this protection, though, non-Muslims had to pay a tax called jizya. So jizya was a special tax levied on particularly Jews and Christians, who were called dhimmis, which was a sort of a name for their status under Muslim rule. This tax was different to the zakat, which was a tax that only Muslims had to pay, and non-Muslims were exempt from. In return for paying this tax, the Muslim ruler was to protect their minorities. However, there were also other restrictions to be placed upon Jews and Christians, which had to be upheld for the protection to continue. So I'll just summarize some of the restrictions that were placed by the Pact of Umar on Jews and Christians in the next slide. So these included not being able to build new places of worship or repair broken down places of worship, being obliged to feed and house a traveling Muslim for at least 3 days, not to manifest a religion publicly but having to keep it quiet, having to give up their seats for a Muslim should he request, having to dress differently to Muslims, being forbidden to mount arms, having to conduct sort of religious ceremonies quietly in the shadows, not publicly, building houses with lower roofs than Muslims, also being forbidden to strike a Muslim. Now, there was obviously differences in how these laws were enforced, in particular how strictly they're enforced, but in essence, these restrictions were designed to render Jews and Christians as second-class citizens. So there was a degree of persecution. It was not a paradise under the Muslim rule either. Now, however, while this pact discriminated against Jews and Christians, it also protected them in some way because it gave them a legal status and it gave them rights as long as they obeyed the pact. So while the Sephardim were definitely second-class citizens under Muslim rule, they were at least citizens with rights. And this is actually far better than under the Visigoths because they often had no rights at all under the Visigoth Christians. So at least under the Muslims they had rights. And this situation also remained relatively stable for a few centuries, which allowed the Jews to adapt effectively. And Jews were therefore given enough rights, enough freedom, even though there was a degree of persecution, to worship freely, study religious texts, engage in commerce, and even engage in secular studies such as medicine. And under these conditions, Jewish civilization flourished. And that will be all for this week. I hope I've left you on an interesting cliffhanger to actually to want to learn more about the Jewish Golden Age in Spain. Next week I'll be talking about the Golden Age, some of the great figures, and also just some of the developments which happened. A really, really amazing time in Jewish history.